stopped being on there until they're at least 16 years old. That is the nuts and bolts of what this bill does. As I say, there is no specific platform named in the bill, which is in and of itself quite weird, because if you listen to most of the reporting currently, it sounds like we have a clear list of who's in, who's out. That is not currently the case. There was a much longer explanatory memo, which is basically the government saying, this is what we kind of think we're going to do with this legislation, but that is not the same thing as being enshrined in law. So the actual process as it's supposed to happen is that the communication minister of the day is supposed to basically have a list, and they designate, it's not the right word perhaps, but they stipulate which platforms and which tools this applies to and which don't. There was a lot of discussion in the lead up to this, whether, for example, YouTube was in or out, whether Snapchat was in or out. And to be honest, those questions are sort of still fuzzy, because what this law the only thing this law can do is legislate about account-based use. So there is actually no way, according to this legislation, to address watching a YouTube video. It can only address having an account on YouTube that then allows YouTube as a platform to suggest and direct your video watching. And while that sounds like a semantic thing, it's really not. The difference between accessing something versus being able to have an account on something is quite different. So we know anyone can watch YouTube content without a YouTube account. We know the same is also true for TikTok, which is one of the biggest platforms focused on here is that sort of TikTok. If there's a spectrum and we sort of have what's the evilest platform according to the government, TikTok's probably at the evilest end. But still, you can watch TikTok content without being logged in. Not all of it, but the vast majority.
Yeah.
So we have to keep in mind that this doesn't actually prevent access to content. It prevents the account-based use of particular platforms, which is a distinction that you probably do need from the beginning. As I say, we don't know which things are definitely in and out. And the really tricky thing is, because this law doesn't actually kick in for 12 months, and that's in part to allow the platforms to figure out how they're supposed to do their bit. And their bit is supposed to be knowing how old someone is when they ask to use that platform. Now, of course, knowing how old is not limited to children. It's how old any user is. So at that point, any Australian user will have to somehow have their identity, or at least their age, verified for the purposes of that platform. The government has said it's not their job, it's the platform's job. But the very last amendment that was glued onto this, literally minutes before it was voted on, was a specific amendment that says platforms cannot request government-issued ID as the primary or only choice for verifying identity. Now, that doesn't mean that the platforms can't ask for a government-issued ID. What it means is there has to be some other option also available. Now, the least good version of that from a privacy perspective might be that the platforms offer a really intensive biometric option where you might have your face and your iris or your whatever scanned. And if you're not comfortable with that, then you can enter something like a passport or a driver's license. So that would currently be legal according to what's in the bill. So it's not that government IDs might not be used, it's just they can't be the only or primary option. There is an age assurance trial, which is something that is a separate entity that in the best world and the world before this bill was rushed through was supposed to happen first. So we were going to try different technologies, say, can age assurance, which is, based partly on estimation as much as anything else, how good can that get? Can you actually estimate someone's age from scanning their face? And the answer is kind of not very well. You can do it better in terms of white faces. You can do it really badly in terms of darker skin faces, for example. So that's not really a good option at all. It's something that can be filled by drawing on a moustache, for example, which is almost comically bad. But we don't know, because that trial hasn't happened, we don't know how much the government will push platforms to take certain technologies on board or not. But we do know it's the platforms ultimately that have to make that choice, not the government, even though the government is running the trial. So that's all of these are sort of moving parts that are essentially, if you imagine the bill as a manila folder that says insert instructions here, that's what the bill currently does, except for stipulating the age and the date that it will kick in, which is a year from the date that the legislation passed. When there's an election and we get a different or even the same communications minister, it will be their job then to write down either which platforms this does apply to or which platforms it doesn't. So they can choose either to have a list of what's in or a list of what's not in, and that's kind of up to them. So it doesn't give that clarity about which platforms it applies to. I think that's the sort of the nuts and bolts of the actual piece of legislation that was passed. Obviously, the reason for it was a very strongly led conservative move that said that the only way to help young people have better experiences online is to make them not available until they're a certain age. I think, like most people in this area that we're advocating, nobody is suggesting more regulation is a bad thing, but what we mostly were suggesting is better regulation, nuanced regulation that made the platforms make the experiences of younger people safer and better, rather than removing all of the opportunities that might come from participation. I think that's been sort of the through line for most of us that have been, what are you doing? The other thing to keep in mind is that most of the technical solutions young people will be able to get around in about 25 seconds. Like, you know, most anything that involves entering text-based information or having your computer say where it is geographically, we know young people can just use a VPN and get around that. Now, we know there are all sorts of other reasons people might be familiar with those technologies that currently exist. So that's the nuts and bolts as well in terms of the technical side, which we genuinely don't believe this government understands how easy it will be to circumvent. So it will provide, or moving on to sort of thinking about what the biggest problems are, from my perspective, the biggest single issue is this will give parents a false sense of security that they don't need to worry about this. They don't need to be talking about this until young people are 16. That for me is the biggest challenge here, because the kids will go to other spaces. If they can't get into the mainstream spaces, they'll go somewhere else, and those spaces will be probably darker and murkier and have less regulation.
Yep.
And there will be more need for those parental conversations, but parents will be like, oh, but you're not supposed to be there till you're 16. It's not really my problem. And schools, of course, will then be in the bind of, can they actually teach about social media if you're not supposed to be? And I think historically schools have been very, well, we don't really teach this until you're the age that you're supposed to be using it. So that's going to be another bind. I think, one of the things that might come, like if you look for a sort of a silver lining, what could happen is that there could be an absolute avalanche of resources and money put into digital literacy that says that if we can't teach them in these spaces, can we simulate and teach them the best possible ways to be digital citizens, so when they hit 16, they're fully prepared for that experience. That's, I think, an optimistic read of what might happen, because there hasn't been any suggestion of building separate literacy programs apart from what already exists. And there is some great stuff out there, but it is not at the scale that's needed to actually address young people feeling fully informed, as fully informed digital citizens when they hit the age of 16. So I feel it was Vanessa. I think from the initial questions that you sent me, I think that was my pre-prepared spiel. Is there anything that I didn't address that you wanted me to before it's more of a conversation?
No, I think that's fantastic. Yeah, I think you've given us an excellent overview of what's there, nuts and bolts wise. What are the components that are sort of there and tangible? What are the vagaries? What is suggested, but highly dubious and yet to come at this point? And yeah, sort of key risks and concerns, and potentially some opportunities, I suppose, as well. I think that's, it is important when I think it's probably safe of me to say that there's a large number of people in our community management space that are probably less supportive of this regulation than perhaps the general public and the government. Certainly not, I think aligned with what you said, very much wanting to very much invested in creating safer spaces online. But I think understanding, because of what we do, a lot more of the sophistication and the complexity of this, and knowing that usually these sort of binary turn the tap on and off solutions aren't often the best approach. So we share a lot of those concerns. We've got some really excellent questions from folks that I've gathered in advance, and also some excellent ones coming through in the chat. So maybe we'll just kind of launch into those. I mean, I think one of the, I think there's a number of impacts I see this having potentially on community management and moderation. In line with, I suppose, some of the additional compliance and concerns that we already had introduced with the Online Safety Act, given this is in fact an amendment to that. One of the ones that was raised, of course, already was, and you've spoken to this to a degree already, will it introduce additional moderation complexity in terms of additional age verification methods and things like that, and sort of gating and onboarding, qualifying things. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is, with the information we have, if we are operating on one of the platforms that it ends up encompassing, so let's say Facebook, Instagram, something like that, the answer is probably no, we won't have to introduce those measures. It would be incumbent on the platform, as you said. However, if this is a private or owned or alternative social media platform that does also end up being swept up in this, which we don't know yet, then potentially yes. I suppose if we have the control to configure those settings in terms of onboarding, who is allowed in, who isn't, what are the gatekeeping steps, what is the onboarding protocol, potentially, if that's loosely configured and we make that call as community strategist, community owner, we might see ourselves in a position to have to introduce additional age concerns as part of that. Would you say that's correct? There's a lot of speculation in there, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's as correct as we can say could be correct. And it is that sort of fuzzy area around the smaller bespoke services that would not have the same profile as the platforms that this bill is obviously going after. But at the same time, it will depend on who's in government and how they imagine, or what they imagine this actually doing. So I think a platform of any size or a tool of any size would need to know how would it answer that question quickly if it was forced to.
Yeah, great. That's my understanding too, and I think it is obviously, so in that regard, I think it's something that we need to start thinking about. As the details, we'll see how it plays out. But I think that if you are in that position, we do have quite a number of quite large communities in Australia on those sort of platforms that do at least partially encompass users under 16 in many cases. They need to be, if they haven't already, starting that work of, what modifications, what might we need to make? How might we consider changing our onboarding sort of funnel and sort of member qualification process to at least make that determination so we could be compliant if that is indeed a requirement. Similar to what we did when the Online Safety Act came in and we introduced additional reporting mechanisms around moderation activity, so that if the E-Safety Commissioner were to reach out and say, talk to me about the reports of abuse in this space, talk to me about the incidences of XYZ, risk or harm, how have you dealt with those in this given period? We are in a position to do that as part of a compliance measure, and most communities are doing that now, which is great. So that kind of answers my question. So, and I suppose the big question a lot of people have been asking, and I think we've partly addressed it, but I might have you speak to it anyway, is, can we speculate a little about what platforms are going to be included here? So, as you said, while the legislation does not explicitly name things, a lot of the commentary, including some of the government media releases and media statements, do name platforms. So we've heard, all meta platforms, but then not YouTube, but then Reddit I've heard listed as included in the ban quite a lot as well in certain situations. So people are asking, will my platform X be affected? Will forum communities be affected? There's a number of very large, very thriving forum communities in Australia still, particularly those that are targeted at young people and actually provide, some of those therapeutic and peer support communities, which even have government funding. So what would you say to those people, I guess, given we don't know? What would you say to them around those questions at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a safe bet that all of the big platforms will definitely be included. So everything Meta, TikTok, Snapchat, Reddit was definitely in for most of the conversations that were had.
Yeah.
Beyond that, what I think was signaled very late in the piece is that if there was a good reason, so I think some of the mental health forums were explicitly said we would never include this. So I think the logic there was that if the government gets a good case for why this shouldn't be a thing that it's applied to, and they understand that logic, they signal at this stage at least being open to those sort of dialogues.
Exception,
So I
perhaps.
think for the big sort of community-based forums that are running on their own software or like an instance of something, then I think articulating the reason why this community matters and the things that it already does, the fact that these are moderated spaces and so on and
Yeah,
so
that's
forth,
right. And they typically
probably
do have extensive, like really robust moderation compared to many of those social media platforms.
yeah. So I think making that case might be enough for each specific community to be excluded. Like we don't know that for a fact, but my sense is that if it was the current government, at least, that they would be open to those arguments, especially because they've been having to make up responses to that pretty much on the fly. And so their in and out list, while it changed around quite a lot in the last fortnight, at the same time, they were clearly trying to be responsive to the idea that if there's a community that exists that is demonstrably supportive and doesn't carry the risks, and because as well, most of the risks that they highlighted were algorithmic risks. While cyberbullying was sort of part of the media stuff around this, really what was focused on was the algorithmic harms more than anything else. And so I
Yeah.
think a lot of these forums really don't have that as a
Certainly not to the extent.
issue. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's important to consider. So I think, again, it's probably wise to be on guard a little bit. And, if you do have a community on any kind of a community platform that is accommodating, serving that user base, either explicitly or, as part of your larger user makeup, to start thinking about what provisions you might need to take and how this might affect you. And to your point, to start, if it is, like a reach out, which I think was explicitly discussed at one point, but many other communities, as you know, we really lead. We're leaders internationally in terms of those mental health community spaces. If they are, to start articulating and preparing your compelling case for exception, perhaps to start considering, if you haven't already, and many will have already, evidencing this is who we are, this is why we are, these are these, here, look at our governance, it's expansive, it's considered, it's responsible, it's diligent, it's compliant with legislation, and we serve this really critical purpose. So we would seek an exemption based on that potentially. So again, good to start thinking about, obviously, yes, and keep your ear to the ground in terms of the developments that will invariably come out, I suppose, in the next 12 months or so. I think you've mentioned a couple of times, and certainly it's one of my concerns as well, is, as with some of the powers of the E-Safety Commissioner as well, there is, that, I suppose, concern around politicization or even weaponization of these sorts of powers. And, as it might all be well and good. You may have a government of the day that decides, actually, we're going to be pretty light touch with this. These big mainstream platforms where we have a lot of evidence of algorithmic harms and other issues, we're going to put them squarely in our sights, and they can afford to take these measures, and we can afford to find them and everything else. But these smaller platforms or ones with compelling cases, not a problem at all. We trust you, you're all good. But other governments might take a very different view, or they might, seek to make those decisions from a more political standpoint or even an ideological standpoint. So they might have a platform for LGBTQI plus youth if that community is something that is not necessarily respected or served by a particular political party or political persuasion. Maybe that would then become a target of this sort of thing. So I think that is definitely a floating concern. Do you share that concern? And again, what do you think about here?
Well, given the current political climate, things that we would have, say, a few years ago gone, no sane government would go after X, Y, or Z group. We're not living in that world anymore. Like, we are in a surprisingly reactionary and conservative political space right now, where gains that have been made over the last half century seem to be rolled back in all sorts of ways. So I wouldn't say for sure that anything was safe. And that the idea that this tool could be used ideologically more than anything else is not inconceivable. It really does depend which government we're looking at in a year's time when this actually becomes, activates. But being prepared for it not to be used in a sensible way, considering the way that it was designed in a relatively nonsensible way, doesn't seem beyond the realms of expectation. At the same time, I wouldn't know how to prepare for that other than going, if there's an opportunity to dialogue as this process is developed, jump in and dialogue. But there is no way of knowing today what that dialogue will be, because it feels like this is essentially going to be on the shelf until after the election now.
That's a really good point. One of the questions we had submitted was, which I thought was a very interesting one, I'm quite sure something you've given thought to, is how do you feel as an expert in this space that this legislation might affect online communities, either on those big social media platforms or on those alternative platforms, just across the board, with older but still fairly young members and users and participants? So say 16, 17 through say early 20s. Maybe communities explicitly for that age group, or just where they represent a decent number of users and participants. Do you think that will change, I guess, their awareness of these communities, their ability to access and be onboarded? Might it impact sort of the recruitment and awareness strategies of the folks running those online communities?
I mean, it's hard to answer that because it is a very abstract thing. I mean, what I would say is there are lots of pathways to information, pathways to community, and pathways to harm, to be fair, that have come from existing social media platforms as the major gateways. They're the spaces where we know young people are, and if we want to find them, seeding something in those spaces that directs them somewhere else has been a very significant strategy for helping young people find anything. If that space essentially goes away, then we need to build other mechanisms to build those pipelines where young people find out about stuff. And I'm really not quite sure what those pipelines look like. Like, there are existing things that are of significantly that don't work as well currently. But if that's the only things left, then I guess we amp some things up. We may need to build other sorts of infrastructure, and it may be that those alternative, smaller community spaces become much more important because they're what's left and maybe the things that remain legal. So it might be that some spaces become much more important than they've currently been because they're it when Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Snapchat go away. So it's not something we can give an absolute answer to, but what we can say is people's pathways to knowledge and community will definitely shift.
Are changing. Yeah, I think you're right. And apologies. I know it is a little bit of it's definitely a big hypothetical there. But look, I think that is something sort of strategically that a lot of community professionals that I've been speaking to are thinking about, how they might reach those folks and how might we design or co-design some of those pathways. And I do think, it might represent some risks and some concerns for some of them, especially if they have to disrupt very established ways of working and patterns. But I do think perhaps that therein lies arguably maybe one of the upsides of this, if it does work out that way, if it might result in a more usage or more uptake of those sort of smaller, more intimate sort of cozy web style spaces, and that may not be a bad thing. We know that often those are healthier spaces. They are typically more effectively community managed and are often absent those big broad stroke algorithmic harms you spoke about. I've got some really interesting questions, a whole number of them actually, around this idea of media literacy. So as you've pointed out and know intimately through your research, we know young people are online really early for a variety of reasons. This is for a long time now has been a key lens and pathway portal through which they sense make about themselves, their identities, others, the world around them. And amongst that, develop and fine-tune their media and social media literacies around all sorts of things. Not always effectively, but they are going through those processes, certainly. What impacts, if any, could you see this type of legislation, this type of ban having on the media literacies, or the sort of the technological and media literacies of young people in Australia. You know, if they're, you know, as our Prime Minister paints a picture of, you know, out frolicking in the sunshine instead, and then like, oh, what's this internet thing, right? I mean, obviously they'll be potentially using it through school and work, so it's not like it'll be a foreign concept. But you know, if they are not in these spaces in the same way, what might they be denied? How do you think that might change that media literacy space broadly?
Yes, I mean, what I would say is that the media literacy and digital literacy space in Australia has been massively underdeveloped anyway. So we don't, while we have media literacy in a very sort of vague piecemeal way across the national curriculum, it's woefully inadequate anyway. So starting from that as a point, and thinking that one of the main bodies that let us fund digital literacy stuff was unfortunately the platforms we're about to ban.
Yeah.
So they had an onus to try and look like they were doing something, and dropping money into various, you know, national programs was one of the few things they could do to look like they were trying to help.
Right.
So unfortunately, that pot of money probably goes away, or is harder to.
I was thinking about that too. I know it's often quite performative from their point of view, but it can result in really real.
Yeah, but resources are resources sometimes.
Yeah, that's
right. So we will need to push harder on things like the government. Like if we are to have any sense that this law was seriously trying to help, then pushing much harder for resourcing for digital literacy programs and scaffolding that much better across the curriculum, I think, is the only real lever left to be hard pushed by, you know, to state to state, and because every state has you know gone, oh, this is such a good idea, we're going to fix things. So there is an onus on the states and the national level to then fund the things that might help, and literacy programs that are not one-off piecemeal things. Like, unfortunately, the Alana Madeline Foundation is fantastic, but they keep getting trotted out by this government as, oh, we've solved digital literacy. We put money into Alana Madeline Foundation, and they can run something for any school at any time. Yes, they can, but it's usually a one-off or a short-term program. It's not a consistent program across the entirety of schooling. The fact that we don't have a consistent or meaningful way to address mis and disinformation at all in the curriculum. Like, it's sort of there if you look really hard, but it's certainly not a key flag thing. When we see, you know, research says that it's not just young people, that across the board, most Australians do not feel like they've got the skills to be able to spot something as basic as, I don't know, text scams. Like, people fall for them all the time because they don't have the literacy to unpack those in a meaningful way. That is something very teachable. And so there are other points in the system, I guess, where digital literacy is desperately needed. And so as I say, my most optimistic reading of this is that if we're going to ban people from these spaces, we have to use the time to equip them so that they're ready when they get access. And so that's the argument for much more robust digital literacy across the board. I have seen no evidence of that process happening yet, but I think that's the one really loud thing that we can all still do. Is like, okay, the ban's coming, we're creating a space where harm is supposed to not happen. How do we ensure that the 16-year-olds, at the same time that they're looking at getting driver's licenses and doing all of these other things, can hit social media equipped for what they're about to see? And I think that's the big argument. So
I think you're right.
If everyone who was distraught about the ban being such a blunt tool goes, here's the one thing we can do to help, maybe we can push that into the national curriculum more fully and have all sorts of other programs developed. I think I saw, so I can't see all the comments, but I see them when they pop up for a second. I think it was a librarian in the room. The idea that we need to get people back into libraries as a point of communication and thinking about the digital, I think is a real possibility now, in a way that, you know, there is space being created. Going into libraries and other spaces of informed literacy is actually a real opportunity. So we'll see how we go. But as I say, there's no current plan that I know of to do that, but it'd be great if something does happen.
Yeah. Look, I couldn't agree more, and I can see from the engagement in the chat that many are very, very much on your team on this one. And I do think this is probably I think most people would broadly agree with this, right? So maybe this is an area where we can use this as an opportunity, not just to meet this immediate corrective that we need, but also to kind of look at, you know, what we've where we've neglected this previously. You're right, we haven't done a great job of this. It's not as rigorous as it could be, or as expansive or sustaining. So how do we get this right so that we can, maybe we need like a digital Rumspringer. Some really interesting ideas. I think, community, and this is just my personal opinion here, but again, I think some would agree that I really believe that those who've managed communities, particularly those who've done so in therapeutic contexts and sort of managed complex communities and highly regulated industries, and just we are really attuned to the complexity of risk and harms, and are used to designing governance around this and being the implementors, or the co-implementers of this stuff, and also again attuned to both the greatness and the opportunities and all the good stuff, and those less than good things as well about these spaces and what they can deliver for young people. So I think I would love to see community managers as practitioners, those that are keen. And I know there are a number, involved in that conversation. I think we have a lot to contribute as these digital frontline workers. We are community stewards. We can act as, maybe we're sort of digital citizenry stewards. There could be some really interesting roles and opportunities, I think, for us to join in that dialogue and play quite an active role. I think, we are, to me, it seems foolish to ignore us as, it's not a huge number of people, but we know we have roughly 6,000-7,000 people doing this work in Australia who are sitting embedded in these spaces. So that's, a citizen army of a sort that the government, if it wants to, could tap and could work with in a systematic way, to be educators, to educate users and stakeholders, to role model, to steward. We're doing those things anyway in a very localized community context. Some may be interested in doing so in a more sort of macro sense, if that makes sense, for the government. We've got some very specific questions, sort of building on your initial comments about the law. So I'll just share those. Does the legislation specifically create a mechanism to either list those that must comply or to list those that don't have to comply? Or is it really as vague as using the term social media? So you sort of partially spoke to that before. Do you mind revisiting that and elaborating a little?
Yeah, so I would need to check the wording specifically again, but the only thing that's defined is social media in incredibly broad terms, and then it specifically says that it will be up to the communications minister of the day to specify platforms. Now, it doesn't specify whether that's a list of in or a list of out, simply that they would specify, as I understand it. And it might be easier to specify who the law applies to rather than who it doesn't in the first instance, because I think that there are numbers somewhere between 6 and 200 was the amount of spaces that the government imagined this would apply to from day one, and the difference between those two numbers is vast. So I think it really, the piece of communication that needs to happen as quickly as possible once we know who is responsible for communicating that is who's in and who's out. And it's not the big players, because we know the big players are definitely out, but it's all of the other medium and smaller spaces. And whether it's an instance of a space or an instance of a platform. So like, would Mastodon as a platform be out, or would specific instances be out? That's not clear either. Yeah,
that was a nuanced question I had as well. I think a number of others did. Exactly right, because we do have so many platforms that are splintered and owned, and we can build various instances on. So that's exactly right. And we have a lot of these platforms. Mastodon is used to build harmful communities and for, kind of bad actors together, as it is the exact counterpoint. So something like Telegram, for example, is a messaging app, which I heard a lot of discussion about messaging apps probably not being included, but then obviously we also know those are, organizing hubs for, all sorts of actors, including many in the misinformation and organized disinformation space. So
I mean, my sense of that initial discussion about messaging apps being exempted, I suspect that will go away very quickly once people realize that the cyberbullying, which was one of the big things that was supposed to be solved by this, has not been addressed by the current piece of legislation at all. And the logical outcome is that if you take away direct messaging in, meta apps, of course, but WhatsApp, of course, is a meta app. But anyway, the idea that WhatsApp would have initially been exempt, I think, will go away pretty quickly. I think as soon as the logic of doing that is actually scrutinized, my suspicion is it will be on the list pretty quick.
Yeah, I would have thought. I mean, it did seem like very odd logic. It sounded like folks who didn't necessarily understand the technology were having.
It was very much them making up the list in response to journalist questions at the moment in time. It wasn't.
What about my company Slack? No, well, that's right, right. And there's some really excellent points. Rick is showing in the chat, and he's absolutely right. You know, maybe it will prompt younger folk who already are very good at obviously circumventing these sort of things, of course, but it might actually increase their technical skills. You know, I'm a Gen Xer. I came up my era of social media. We all kind of coded. We all did HTML. I mean, we're not, you know, I'm not a programmer or anything, but you had to learn in a lot more DIY hands-on way, because that's the state. That was the state of the technology, to build your own instances of things, or to customize various things in your communities. And things have got a lot more neat and clean and sort of self-service, and it's all done for you these days. Maybe we'll get folk back into you know, a space where they're actually, you know, hacking at open source code to build their own, recreate some of these sites or recreate some of these platforms. You might see a resurgence in STEM skills. There you go. I'm sure the government will love that.
Maybe. Yeah.
No, it's very interesting. So we had a very specific question from a community manager who works in health, in the health space. And I thought this was an excellent one. So we have obviously very discrete owned health communities on those alternative platforms, like your Reach Outs, Beyond Blues, etc.
Yeah.
And then we also have, and Starlight Foundation for that matter as well. Then we also have, you know, these health communicators and health organizations, again, often not-for-profit, government funded, at least in part, utilizing popular social media channels, TikTok, Insta, etc., to educate, to engage in, you know, public health campaigns targeted at young people, to promote literacy around key health issues, and in some cases to recruit and draw folks into those specific communities around things like mental health situations and different circumstances. So the question was, you know, as someone who's in that health space, you know, ostensibly in the education and well-being kind of categories that were discussed a little by the politicians, you know, would the same rules apply? You know, so would they have to basically potentially cut off using those channels, and then just focus on other channels and those owned spaces, providing they can build those cases around exemption that you talked about? Or would potentially they be able to build a case for exemption that was inclusive of those platforms?
If I understand correctly, if those platforms are being used to seed educational literacies and pathways for people to find something that they can then get off platform, then my sense is keep doing that and that will be fine. And I think what we're going to have is this awkward bifurcation where some kids who are less technical and whose parents are more absolute in terms of the law, they're the ones that will come off. There'll be a whole bunch of people that stay on in various capacities, whether that's technical or something else, ways of getting around this. So unfortunately, the need to serve both will probably exist rather than going shift everything from here to here.
Right.
But I think in that sense of seeding resources across social media, a lot of that I would suggest is probably still really, really valuable, because it'll probably still be seen. And what we don't know is that while this law doesn't grandfather, so in theory, if you're 14 when this law kicks in, according to the current legislation, you would get pushed off social media and then come back when you're 16. How on earth that happens technically, whether that really happens or not, I think is also slightly fuzzy. I think we'll have this weird 3-year transitional thing where even though the law says they're supposed to come off, I just can't see how that's going to happen. I think any 14-year-old is suddenly aging themselves up to 17 according to their date of birth over the next few months. And so...
Right, rapid aging.
Yeah, there's going to be that awkward transition where I would suggest that, unfortunately, having more resources across more spaces and opening more doors to those materials and those pathways is going to be necessary, rather than simply taking stuff from here and putting it somewhere else.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And thank you for raising the grandfathering point. I had forgotten to mention that. But yes, so as you said, currently the idea is that yes, it's not, if you're there and you're under 16 now, you're okay, you can stick around. Actually, theoretically, you're seemingly supposed to be booted off. So that will very much represent an interesting process. I think, you know, my sense, understanding the internet, to some degree is that, like, I think you're right. You're going to be, by, try, and more forcations going on where you've got, just more streams of work, more micro segments of like, I just think it's going to be, if you are working in the space, if you're managing more marketing style communities, if you're managing health or therapeutic communities, regardless, I think your communications, there'll just be channels added to the calendar rather than channels and audience groups or segments disappearing. It might actually be just a splintering of those.
Yeah. I think for health professionals, they often have to work around where the law says people are and what they're actually doing at the moment anyway. And I think this will be one extra sort of dance that they have to dance to say, we know they're not supposed to be here, but we kind of want to target them just in case they are, because maybe your law's not perfect. And I think health communicators are pretty good at that dance already, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked a little bit about, the addition in the write-up around that last minute kind of push around, we will not require this government ID necessarily. It can be something that's asked for, but it's not going to be the sole or only sole or primary identifier. There is a lot of concern around privacy, and obviously a lot of privacy experts did weigh in on this and express some serious concerns. So to us in community management, we are dealing with user data a lot of the time. We're already pretty schooled up on privacy and need to be very vigilant around that, even more so if we have an own space where we have custody of that data. Do you think, I guess, how do you see this privacy stuff playing out? Do you think that it's likely to result in the introduction of different kinds of digital ID, even though I know the government is not really saying that or stressing that at this point? Do you just, if I could ask you to speculate, knowing what you know, having the body of knowledge you do you think that that's probably likely given the way this sort of stuff is unfolding, or do you think that it's just too unknown to even speculate?
I guess the other thing that's really important to say is that this piece of legislation is not the only space where that conversation is currently happening. So part of the age assurance trial was also supposed to be, can we prevent under 18-year-olds accessing pornography?
Yes.
And
right.
so if you look at both of those things at the same time and you say, what is the mechanism that can achieve this? It's inconceivable to me that there won't be a mechanism that involves people giving ID to someone.
Yes.
Now, I think the E-Safety Commission did a really interesting roadmap, and I think the suggestion was the least harmful way that they could see this being done was there to be a third party that basically looked at ID, authenticated it, and then produced a token that could be given to any platform or tool that asked for it. But we also know that the E-Safety Commissioner made it very clear in the last little while that they did not see themselves as holding that function. So it's not clear who would be this magical third party that would see all the IDs, say, yes, I've seen it, and then tell everybody else that, yes, this person is this age. That does seem to be the best outcome. But if nobody wants to put their hand up to be that entity, and we don't trust the government, in inverted commas, to do it, then who's left?
Who's going to do it? Yeah.
So in the absence of that, it feels like platforms having direct access to lots of people's IDs, whether those platforms are Meta or Pornhub, seems like the only real outcome I can see, that if we actually truly seriously want this to work. I don't think that's a good exchange. I don't think that's personally think that's a terrible idea, but I don't see how else technically it could be done in a way that's legally convincing.
Yeah, look, it's an excellent point, I think, and look, it's definitely very much still on the table. We just don't know, but I think you're right, and I think if you did, I know there's a bit of research about this already, of course, around polling trust levels and sort of cynicism around government institutions versus social media platforms, and look, neither of them are particularly trusted. And if you polled the folks in this room, I suspect most of them might say they'd rather the government than social media platforms, but straw, very anecdotal poll, you get a different result somewhere else. So I think it's hugely tricky, right? Because you need who's going to be the trusted arbiter of these sorts of mechanisms. So that's why I do see potentially, whether it's intended that way or not, I can see a future where the guardians of various online communities, again, whether they asked for that position or not, whether they're doing it professionally, formally or not, end up having to make some of these decisions and and certainly having to field questions and discussion and discourse around this as part of their governance work and their conversations with their users and members. They're going to get a whole bunch of questions about this that they, probably aren't easily going to be able to answer in the short term. So it's why thank you for sharing your knowledge. It's really helpful. One thing I wanted to ask, and again, I think I know the answer, which is we just don't know yet. But again, if I could beg your indulgence, we understand that the legislation or the proposed legislation talks about the onus being on the platforms to enforce this, right? So yes, not the businesses, not the government, not the owners of these communities, not community managers, no users, platforms. However, my question is on behalf of our community. Could you see a world in which community managers or anybody that's administrating an online community, would there be compliance requirements or expectations perhaps around enforcing this? So for example, if, as you said, and as I think we all suspect, young people are going to get around this, they'll circumvent it in various ways. Let's say your community says, no, you have to be over 16 to join. That's on the platform to make that happen. And we have people joining that we suspect with cause are not that age, that have actually circumvented that. What do you think our position would be? I mean, I think, would we be expected to then uphold the law? Do we report that to the e-safety commissioner? Do we report it to Facebook or whatever platform we're on? What sort of compliance mechanisms and reporting mechanisms do you think might exist in this world?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't give you a concrete or meaningful answer to that. What I can say is that this is a space I don't think that was well imagined as the bill was rushed into existence. What we know is that the government was very, very sure to say that neither young people nor parents could be in any way made responsible or punished, and that platforms were seen as the other end of that spectrum. But those middle points, which is where community managers often exist, I don't think anybody thought to even ask that question. My suspicion is that probably it would not be on the community managers at the scale of many of the communities we're talking about here, unless they were somehow back-ended by one of the things that is then on the shit list. But I really can't give a meaningful answer beyond that, just because the legislation is so thin and just doesn't give us answers.
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate that, and that was a bit mean of me to ask you. I know that we don't know, but I suppose I raise it for our audience today as well, just because I think this is where the rubber will meet the road for us. We already have, obviously we're already regulating defamation. We're already regulating hate speech. We're doing quite a lot of work as little mini, non-lawyery, but micro regulators nonetheless in these spaces, often because that's aligned with the values and the context of our community anyway. So there's a logic and an integrity to that. But I think, I could envision a situation where, folks are either taken upon themselves to do this or are potentially expected to, and it's sort of another, adding to that regulatory burden of community management, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think just needs to be recognized and discussed, particularly when we talk about that as a practice still being often fairly misunderstood, not incredibly well respected, and sort of or understood at a mainstream level yet. So I think we're in this position where we can make a positive difference, and I would say already are in many instances. So I would love to see various actors, government, policy bodies, all sorts, peak bodies, interfacing with those that are stewarding these environments and making sure at the very least they're aware of what best practice is and what to do. And I think learning from each other, because we often organically reach best practice, even, just through the experience of managing these digital environments over a lot of years. Any parting thoughts or words of advice you would have, Tama, for folks who are, managing communities, moderating communities in the next little while?
Look, one thing I would say, and which was even evident from the little bits of commentary that I could see, is the value of having a managed community will go up exponentially. Like, I think if there is a single argument that says, why should this space be left alone for a little while? It's the fact that it's already a managed community, that there's already this investment in making it the best possible space it can be in the terms that we've already accepted. So I think hammering that point feels like the punchline to this conversation, but also something well worth saying, is that managed communities, as they exist through the lens of this group, are already doing a lot of the things that the government wants done. And being able to articulate that back when asked is going to be incredibly important.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. I agree. I think our work's more important than ever in that sense. So keep doing what you're doing, everyone. Please thank Tama for his valuable time. Really, really grateful for your time and your contribution to this discussion. We are in awe of your brain. And please continue to be the strong advocate that you are for, reasoned, sane, balanced digital legislation in this space. We are grateful for that representation as well. We will share these insights with the group and with those that couldn't attend today in a variety of ways. And I've seen a few folks ask about links to the actual legislation and the language of it. I will make sure those are included in all of the wrap-ups that we do communication wise, so you've got those. Thank you so much, Tama. Have a lovely week.
Good luck with it, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. See you, everyone. Thank you.